Good evening, everyone watching. My name is Barry Jarvis. I'm the Director of Parks and Recreation, and on behalf of the town and on behalf of all the committee members of the Open Space and Recreation Plan, I'd like to welcome you here tonight. For those of you who are watching on LCTV, it is on channel 12 and channel 809. We'd like to start by talking a little bit about the Open Space Plan. I will introduce the committee. All of the materials that you are seeing tonight are available both on the town's website, which is longmeadow.org, and also on the Parks and Recreation page, which is lprd.net. So first, with the Open Space Plan, our existing plan is from 2012, and it is now time to go through the process that we go through every 5 to 7 years with regard to reviewing the plan, reviewing our goals and objectives, and getting a lot of community input to put together a new plan. The main purpose of the Open Space and Recreation Plan is preservation of our open spaces, preservation of wildlife that we have in our town and natural resources, and also recreational opportunities. So for those of you that prior to the pandemic and actually through the pandemic, we posted our public survey, which was our first public engagement, and we had over 500 responses, which was pretty impressive, and we were very happy with that. So thank you to everyone who did complete the survey. With the survey results as a committee, and in just a few minutes, I will introduce all of the committee members and who they represent. But we took the survey results and we formulated goals and objectives based on those responses, and that's primarily what we will be talking about tonight. So with regard to the committee, and I'll introduce everyone in alphabetical order, you'll hear their names now, and then as we discuss the goals and objectives in more detail, you will hear from some of them. Kristen Carnahan and Patrick Carnahan. Kristen represents, she's a Longmeadow resident, she is our community liaison. Patrick Carnahan represents the Tree Committee. Andrea Chasen represents the Conservation Commission as well as the Energy and Sustainability Committee. Walter Gunn is on the Planning Board, and he's also part of the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission. Jamie Hench is with us tonight, and he is a representative from the School Committee. As I mentioned, I'm Barry Jarvis. I'm the director of the Parks and Recreation Department. Tim Keene is also here with us. He's the town engineer. Jeffrey McAlmond is not with us as far as I saw, but he's the deputy director of the Department of Public Works. Arlene Miller is not with us tonight. I don't think I saw her. She is part of the Recycling Commission, and Margaret Rockus is the chair of the Parks and Recreation Commission. Before I turn it over to Emily and introduce Emily, I just wanted to, because I think what's going to happen is we have a couple different interactive pieces to our presentation. If at any point, we'll hold questions through the presentation, but during the interactive parts, if anyone has any questions, you can certainly use your menu on the bottom to raise your hand, and you will be unmuted and called upon. And there's also the chat box feature. So if you have any questions or any comments you want to use the chat box, you're welcome to do that. So with that, I will turn it over to our liaison, and that is Emily Slotnick. I'm sorry that it's the waiting room. I'm admitting at the same time. So Emily will take it from here and talk a little bit more in depth about the plan.
Great, thanks, Barry. So I appreciate that introduction and the introduction of the committee. The committee does really the heavy lifting on updating these plans. There's a lot of time, a lot of meetings put together to get this plan updated, and mainly in coordinating the public outreach, making sure that we're getting we're taking the pulse of the community. And I think the 500 responses to the public survey is a testament to that. So a couple of housekeeping items to start here. This meeting is being recorded. So if you are uncomfortable with being recorded, you should not stay on. For everyone else, please assume that what you say can be accessed and viewed by the public. So let's not say anything that we wouldn't say to our parents or our children. You will be seeing my screen as I share the presentation. Everyone coming into this meeting will be muted, and as Barry said, when we get to the discussion period, individuals will be unmuted as they raise their hands or are called upon to speak, and that can happen. The moderators will do that. Let's see, the chat box, again, that's a great way to put your thoughts down during the presentation when you'll all be muted. Again, I just ask everyone to make sure that you do remain muted until you're called upon. And this is just because background noise can be really, make it really difficult to hear the presenters. The controls for your Zoom, if you're new to Zoom, are at the bottom window. If you are on a mobile device, to access the chat box, you need to tap on the participants button, and then the chat window will open. Let's see. For those of you who are calling in, I don't see any of those. Well, one person here is on actually without video, so that might be a phone call. For that person, if you would like to speak to the group, I would just ask that when you are unmuted and when you're asked to speak, please introduce yourself by name, because we won't have a visual record otherwise. So that's it. That's the housekeeping. Let's dive right in. So you may have seen an agenda prior to joining us tonight, but this is essentially what we're going to do tonight. We have had our introduction. I'm going to talk about what open space and recreation planning is, what these plans are for, and what we do to update them. And then we're going to have a large group discussion about the goals and objectives in this plan as they've been updated to a draft version for 2020. And then we'll wrap up and talk about next steps. So what is open space, specifically in the context of open space and recreation planning? Open space can be a lot of things. It's conservation land, forested land, ag land. It also includes some of our recreational assets like athletic fields and playgrounds, pocket parks as well. But it can also be sort of linear space, green buffers around roadways if you've got a highway through your town, which we do here, and then undeveloped land of conservation or recreation interest. And this can be land that's already protected or land that is not protected in any way but remains undeveloped, which in Longmeadow there is not much of, but there's a bit. So the other side of this thing, recreation. What is recreation? We hear a lot about active and passive recreation, so we wanted to clarify these terms up front. Active recreation being the sort of structured sporting type recreation, individual or team activities. They use specific facilities, special facilities like tennis courts or baseball fields, or pools, for instance. Passive recreation, on the other hand, refers to those activities that we don't need to really build facilities for so much. We don't need pavilions. We don't need stands and diamonds and such. We might need a foot trail. But bird watching, jogging, having a picnic, trail walking, trail hiking, these types of things. So within the plan, we go through a specified process that is laid out in the Department of Conservation Services, Massachusetts Department of Conservation Services Open Space and Recreation Plan Guidebook. We look at open space, natural resources, cultural and historic resources, and all those recreation facilities. We are looking at development and growth patterns in the last 7 years since the last OSRP in Longmeadow was published, and looking at how those have or may in the future impact recreation and open space needs and use. And then we come up with an action plan. So we identify our strengths and our weaknesses. Essentially, we identify where things are working and where they aren't. And then we come up with recommendations for how to improve on those weaknesses and bolster those strengths for the next 7 years. Plan components to the right there is just sort of typical items, typical chapters that you'll find in an OSRP, and they correspond color-wise to this sort of timeline we've got at the bottom of the screen. So last fall, we did a bunch of data gathering research, started updating parts of the plan that had to do with demographic information and census data, so on and so forth. January through June, we had a really long and really successful public survey. That was really the most important part of our data gathering thus far. This spring, we obviously had a bit of a hiccup with COVID. We had planned to have this public engagement session in person, and that was actually this winter, but it had to be postponed. And we are now here today. We're having our public visioning session after we had a few months where we met as a committee, did some revision of our draft goals and objectives so that we could bring that into the visioning session as well. Once we get through this visioning session, we are going to take all of the input we've heard here tonight. We're going to synthesize that with the input from the public survey and all of the research that we did prior, and we're going to come up with a draft final plan. We'll post that by the, not July 20th. We'll post that within 2 weeks, and then by the end of August, we will have a draft plan to submit to the state for their review. Let's see here. Okay, so just to make sure that everyone is with me here, I'm going to ask folks to respond to this question in the chat box. And given the fact that I know probably almost half of our group right now is on the Open Space and Recreation Plan Update Committee, I should see a lot of yes, both. But for everyone else, let us know. Are you currently an active volunteer for town recreation or open space activities? And planning is considered an activity. So, if you're on another board to update a plan for a certain park or open space. And feel free to let us know in the chat box with your answer what committee that is or what activity you're volunteering for. And just as we're watching these responses come in, the reason for asking these questions is sort of harkening back to my introduction where I said how important the committee is to doing these plan updates. A lot of open space and recreation advances and operations really rely on volunteer work, and it's not just Longmeadow. This is across the Commonwealth. So we want to honor everyone's contributions here. Great. Okay, so we've got Save Bliss and Laurel Parks. We've got both open space and conservation. Yep. Tree Committee and Bliss Laurel Park. Kristen might have the most here. She's got this committee, Gardeners on the Green, Volunteer Youth Sports, Volunteer Scouts. Fantastic. Okay, so back to the process, and this connects with that last slide with the timeline on the bottom. What the committee has been doing all along, and they'll continue to do, providing guidance and input, conducting the survey, reviewing the goals and objectives, reviewing the draft sections that my team is writing up and sending out for feedback and review. When we get to our final plan, which will be a week and a half, 2 weeks from now, after our final committee meeting, we will submit that first to the relevant boards and commissions for endorsement. And that is, it's sort of a preview. We want the folks who are really going to be looking at this plan for implementation over the next 7 years to have a sense of what's in there and make sure that there is equal support as the plan is reflective of the public input that we had heard thus far. We then send it to the state, as I said, DCS, and they will do a review. They'll tell us if we've missed the mark on any area or missed any required elements. That's generally a pretty quick review. And then it comes back, and with those letters of support from the local committees and commissions, it becomes a final plan. So we've had 5 committee meetings, and the public survey, as I said, January through June, this public visioning session, and then all of that feedback together makes a complete plan update. So other things that go into the planning process are some mapping. This map that you're looking at right now, the protected and recreational open space inventory, this is a work between my team at PVPC and our GIS department, and the committee sort of goes back and forth. We start with a mass GIS data set, and that has to be ground truthed by committee members. So what we're looking at here is all of the land in Longmeadow that is classified as having a primary purpose that falls under a recreation or open space category. And it's color coded and hatched to show us which properties are protected, permanently protected, meaning they can't be developed in the future, which might have some protection, but not permanent, and who owns them, right? So it could be in the case of the some of the Fannie Stebbins property, federally owned and permanently protected. It could be town owned and temporarily protected. So that's what we're looking at here. The permanent protection in Longmeadow, we've got just under 60,000 acres. Sorry, let me back up here. We've got just under 60 properties that are municipally owned, and that's just under 600 acres that are permanently protected. In terms of land trust ownership, land trusts own another 3 parcels, around 130 acres of permanently protected land. And federally, there's the one big parcel for just under 110 acres. And then limited protection, so these are the ones that have a left sort of gray hatch over them, and could have any number of color outlines. We've got 18 parcels in total for just about 330 acres. Chapter 61B, which is a type of temporary protection. There's one parcel which is pretty large, 220 acres. And then there are 4 parcels that are classified as of recreation or conservation interest for just under 370 acres that have no protection at all. And these are the properties that have horizontal hash marks on them. So this is an important map. It's pretty clear on my screen. I think it depends how large your screen is, probably how well you can see this. But it's something that we as planners refer to as we go through this process, and really to evaluate what the opportunities are. So we'll have this map available later on during the discussion we can flip back to. Another really helpful map is this unique environments map. And what we're showing here are really, we're showing climate resilient communities. We are showing protected species and unique species, species of concern. We've got the dragonfly, the northern leopard frog. You've got a handful of endangered species here, priority and exemplary natural communities. You've got a few of those. And again, this comes mainly from mass GIS data. But it's important to know that you've got native plant and animal species here that are listed as threatened or endangered or species of concern under the Massachusetts Endangered Species Act. And we need to protect those species. So on top of those, the State Wildlife Action Plan, that's the SWAP that's right on the sort of second line there. State Wildlife Action Plan, that's telling us what species and natural habitats are in most need of conservation. And it's just for animals. But so those 2 species there, that's important to note. In terms of species of concern in total, you've got 1 bird, 1 reptile, 1 amphibian, 2 fishes, 2 insects, and 8 plants. And most of those, like a lot of the areas of conservation interest in Longmeadow, are located in the meadows. and I don't think that's much surprise. Some are on the Connecticut border, just south of Nevins Avenue. And then the two exemplary or priority natural community cores, these are core habitats that identify specific areas that we need. And so we want to promote long-term persistence of these rare species. And to do that, we need to protect these areas where they exist. And then finally, the S1 and S2 under priority exemplary natural communities, just to give you an understanding of what that is. S1 means critically imperiled communities, where there are typically 5 or fewer documented sites or very few remaining sites across the state. And S2 is imperiled communities, so it's not quite as dire, but still a significant need, typically 6 to 20 sites or fewer remaining across the state. So you've got one of each of those here. So finally, let's get into the survey. Again, we had so much data to work with here because of the great response. So this is really just a snippet. The entire survey results are available on the website on the OSRP update page, as Barry said earlier. So I really encourage folks who are interested in sort of where this summary came from, or interested to see a more detailed look of what the responses were, to just look at the entire survey results. So briefly, the most frequently visited parks, and for those of you who live in the town, I'd be interested to know if these results come as a surprise or not. Those used by the most people on a daily basis are Bliss, the Center School Playground, and the Wolf Swamp School Playground. Most popular for weekly visits are Wolf Swamp Road Fields, Bliss Park, and the Glenbrook Middle School Gymnasium. Most respondents overall say they enjoy passive recreational activities like walking and jogging, but just sort of just below that comes in the participation in town recreation league sports, more so for youth, but also for adults. Some of the concerns that were noted through the survey, and some of these came out of the questions as they were designed, and some of them came in the form of open-ended comments. Insufficient amenities or facilities for skateboarding, off-leash dog walking, road and off-road biking. So a comment might be, we don't have enough bike lanes, or we don't have enough off-road multi-use paths. Concerns that organized sports or recreational youth programming needs improvement, and specifically with regards to existing athletic fields needing some help in their maintenance. With the exception of the high school playing fields, we generally heard that these are in good shape. And the comments that we received really can be summarized by saying these fields are getting a lot of use, and they're not getting proper care. So also with regards to maintenance, but now in our open spaces, maintaining the health of the upland stream environments to support areas lower in the watershed is a concern. Other maintenance needs, back to the recreational facilities, outdated playground equipment, pools and pool buildings need improvements. So again, this is really just a snapshot. It does summarize some of the most frequently stated concerns and likes, if you will, but there's a whole lot more in the survey results, which are posted on the website. Okay, so for those of you, there weren't very many that said no or didn't respond, but if anyone said no or didn't respond, or can't remember what the last time was that you signed up for a volunteer activity, we'll ask you to answer this one. Would you be interested in learning about how to volunteer, or new volunteer opportunities related to recreation and open space in Longmeadow? You're not going to be held to this, but this is something where, again, we hear a lot when I'm doing these plans that people would love to get involved or use some of these resources, or share ideas with their neighbors, but they don't know. So this is getting at that. If you would like to be involved and you don't know how, we want to make sure that we can help out with that.
So we do want people typing at this time. So
Thank
if
you.
people want to go back into the chat as they did the last question and type in, that would be great. We love volunteer groups. Certainly feel free. Again, we won't hold anyone to this, but if you have friends or neighbors that have any interest in anything open space or recreation related, this would be a nice opportunity. And at the end of the whole presentation, Emily and I will have our contact information available. So if anyone wants to reach out, if they don't feel comfortable reaching out now, but they want to after the meeting or at another point, you can send us an email.
All right, great. So moving on, we're going to run through these goals and objectives that have been guiding our plan update. We want to review existing goals and objectives through a critical lens, really to understand also how climate change might impact them. And so this is, again, we're updating a plan that was 7 years old. A lot has happened in our world. And as far as planning and conservation interests go, climate change has become a real core to the conversation in a way that it might not have been 7 years ago. So we do want to make sure that we're filtering through that lens. And just an example of that, a goal of managing healthy forests, for timber, wildlife, and recreation is probably going to be impacted by climate changes that could alter the composition of species in that forest, um, maybe leading to invasive species issues or other aspects of forest health. So we might want to tweak that goal accordingly. Um, and in Longmeadow, recreation needs of residents might be different considering the frequency of things like extreme heat events, right? So we know that we're having up to 90 more days a year of 90-degree days in the next 50 years, and a lesser amount, but also more 95-degree days. I mean, these are extreme heat events, and they put a lot of our population at risk. What does that mean when we're talking about open space and recreation? Well, it means, one, that we might need to think about more splash parks or more shaded areas at our parks where people do want to be outside, where they don't have access to maybe local cooling. Or think about how do we get people safely to our rivers and streams, because we're seeing, especially during COVID time, in this summer in particular, we're seeing real dramatic increases in how many people are using local rivers, local streams, and all sorts of local parks and recreation. So in these goals that you're looking at, new or revised elements that have been tweaked since 2013 are in italics. We're going to go through these, and then we will see these again during our discussion. So goal number one, town-owned parks and conservation areas are used for their intended and allowed purposes and safe for all users. So the one of the initial objectives here was improve compliance with posted rules and regulations for each town-owned park and or conservation area. We've got a couple new ones proposed here, new objectives, that is, expand educational resources about existing open spaces, trail networks, and other resources. Expand community programming to increase residents' exposure and awareness of existing conservation lands and passive recreational resources. And ensure town recreational resources are accessible to residents of all physical abilities. Goal number two, recreation needs of all residents are met by expanding opportunities and upgrading conditions of existing facilities. The existing objective here, provide a sufficient number of fields for each sport such that an appropriate period of field rotation can be applied to ensure the long-term health of the facility. And then a few new ones for this goal. Expand playing hours and seasons for all recreation facilities. Meet community needs for organized and informal team and individual sports, including skateboarding and basketball, and provide safe, ample, and context-appropriate space for dog owners to walk, run, and play with their pets. Goal number 3, local parks and conservation areas are well cared for, managed, and maintained. Objectives here are engage town leaders, community volunteers, and user groups to support maintenance efforts, promote community pride and engender respect for the resources through well-maintained recreation and conservation areas, sustain a healthy townwide tree belt for future generations, and a new proposed objective is to ensure sufficient funding mechanisms exist to support municipal budgets for park and conservation area management. And finally, goal 4 and 5. Goal 4 is the Connecticut River and its floodplain are protected as a wildlife corridor and used for passive recreation. Objectives here are to provide public access to the river for passive recreation and secure permanent protection of the Connecticut River floodplain and its high ecological value. And that goes back to that the critical environments map that we saw earlier. And a new goal, number 5, strengthen Longmeadow's climate change resilience through park and open space design and preservation. Objectives are ensure existing open space and conservation lands are protected from development in perpetuity, prioritize new investments in park and land conservation in locations where climate change impacts such as extreme heat and inland flooding can be mitigated, enhance the capacity of natural systems to accommodate increased intensity precipitation events, and increase park access and distribution for neighborhoods where residents are most vulnerable to climate change. So this is where we're going to transition into our group discussion. But first, I wanted to ask if anyone has any questions about the presentation. If you do, you can raise your hand or type it into the chat box. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. So what this part of the meeting is going to look like, we're going to go through 3 topics: conservation and climate change, facilities and recreation, and so that can be active and passive recreation, and then finally maintenance and stewardship. And on the left side of your screen, you see those 3 topics and you see some numbers next to them. Those numbers are associated with the goals. So for the first topic, conservation and climate change, we're going to be looking at goals 4 and 5. And for each topic as we go through, we want to evaluate the goals and objectives. Do they capture what we need to capture? Do we need to revise them in any way? What are our opportunities for improvement? So once we are comfortable with the goals and objectives, how do we meet those goals and objectives? What sort of work do we need to do, or do we want to propose for the next 7 years for to put into the OSRP action plan? So we want to make sure that we are looking at the goals and objectives, talking about those in the right way, and then from there, where do we go? So that's the format for each one of these topics. We will, let's see, we're going to start with conservation and climate change. And here are the 2 goals. And I believe we have some committee members that are going to help facilitate this discussion.
Hi, Emily. This is Andrew.
Hi, Andrew.
Thanks. I don't know how you want to handle this, but one of the issues, because I was supposed to be helping with the climate change issue, is that, and this is something going forward, when we talk about this goal about strengthening Longmeadow's climate change resilience through park and open space design and preservation, everything that happens within any modifications, changes, has to be looked at with a lens of doing that. So, for example, when zoning and planning, for example, are thinking about giving permission to business development as to create a building without doing anything to use the 5th goal as a lens for approving that, we have to figure out how we make this live and get off of the page here and get into all the critical entities that need to be involved, whether it be the building department, whether it be the zoning and planning, whether it be the town meetings, anything that's happening. We need to be making sure that we're using this, and this document is not just staying on a shelf somewhere gathering dust. So everything we do, for example, at the corner of Bliss and not Bliss, Williams and Dwight, there's a proposal for taking down a lot of trees and putting in another assisted living facility. And it would basically decimate whatever green sponge we have there. And when we looked at it from a conservation commission, I don't know if that's going to go forward. The only thing that the Conservation Commission could talk about was whether or not there was going to be an impact on conservation land. But when we discussed, in fact, whether there was going to be any attempt to keep a sponge, if I'm going to call it a sponge, the green sponge, for reducing loss of the trees and loss of the soil and all of that. Nobody had thought about it and nothing was being done. And the owner of the property is taking it to zoning and planning and just getting approval. Right now, I believe it's still held up because there has to be some state action. But again, if we're really serious about doing this, we have to do it in a way that makes sure that every entity in town has the same approach. That's the only thing I wanted to say.
Yeah, that's great, Andrea. Thank you. And you know, it's what I take away from that is you're comfortable with these goals, but you really want to talk about actions. And one action that might come out of what you're saying could be an ordinance that has to do with impacting impervious or impacting pervious surface in town, and some sort of a no net adverse impact on stormwater flow.
It's not just public, because clearly if it's a private entity that owns it, it's still open space. And so
Sure.
we have to figure out how we can marry the public-private collaboration so that the private entities are also held to the same level of understanding what they're doing is going to have an impact on our overall resilience.
Yes. Any other comments on that?
Emily, this is Kristen, and to Andrea's point, you know, looking at the town as a whole, would it be beneficial to identify those existing sponges so that the community or those in planning and conservation are cognizant of the value of those available parcels, so that maybe, you know, within this bullet, we're looking at acquiring those so that they can support climate change and resiliency, and steering, you know, other kinds of construction to places where it can be handled, and then using best practices during the construction phase.
Yeah, that's a great idea, and that could materialize as as sort of a detailed vulnerability assessment, or some other sort of project where, you know, you want it to happen quickly so that you can implement on a larger scale in the development realm, but really having someone take a scientific look at what open spaces exist and the value that they provide in absorbing rainwater and mitigating flooding and supporting critical habitat.
Really?
Yes.
Hi,
Who do
this
we
is
have here?
Eugene. I don't know if I hit the right button. I don't know if you can hear me okay.
Yep, we can hear you.
I just on that one point, I just throw it in there that it's a relatively new bylaw in the town for new development or redevelopment of over 1 acre, with a lot more stringent requirements for stormwater management. This kind of flows from the MS4 process, as well as you know, Massachusetts stormwater guidelines. So least in the regard for stormwater, new development over 1 acre should have a lot more control and recharge of the aquifer and so forth.
Yeah, I remember that coming up during the municipal vulnerability preparedness process. I think the bylaw was just sort of in process when we were doing that last year. So it would be really valuable, I think, to take a good look at that and evaluate it against these priorities that Andrea and Kristen just laid out, because I think it probably does meet some of those objectives, but maybe not all.
Question to Andrea, is that site she's talking about at the corner of Dwight and William, she said, is that where the daycare center used to be?
That's where the synagogue used to be, yeah. And I believe that they have to go to the state for a determination of need before they can come before the planning and zoning. So I think there are multiple steps that have to take place, but they were before the Conservation Commission back in, I believe, December with the plans.
Good question. Kristen mentioned best practices. Emily, do you have any documents that you look at as exceptionally well done? And if maybe your committee, you've already shared them, but that would be, we could look at, or?
Yeah, I would point you, I think the best one, most comprehensive out there is on climate.gov. It's a climate change toolkit. And this is a place that you can go and really get lost if you have some time, but you could type in zoning tools or regulatory tools, land use planning tools, and you could look up examples of different regulations, different ordinances, different types of vulnerability assessments. You can get case studies that you might want to emulate. So that's a good one. PVPC did a series of tools with our regional Valley Vision about 7 or 8 years ago, I think. And those are also something that I could share. Probably they're available on the website, but I think it's definitely not as user-friendly of a website as the climate.gov.
This is Margaret Rockus. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Margaret.
Hi. I agree. I think it's really important to get an inventory of these sponge spaces, both for planning board, conservation board, also the select board. And my concern is that whenever a nonprofit builds on one of these spaces, and I don't know if the nursing home is or is not, but whenever we have a nonprofit take over a location, I'll wait till the plane passes, I'm outside. Whenever we have a nonprofit take over a location, that nonprofit not only takes that location, they obtain town services such as police and fire. They get the same town services as any other entity that pays real estate taxes. What happens is that we are financially stressed and do not have necessarily the resources to invest in other green spaces, whether that's to make them better, whether to acquire other green spaces. And I would like to see that you can't prohibit anyone from purchasing a plot of land or a building or whatever. I'm not suggesting that at all. What I am suggesting is that the boards who approve this go into it eyes wide open and consider doing what other towns and cities in the state have done, which is to have an agreement with that nonprofit, which may be a very tiny entity or maybe a very large entity, and say, we need payments in lieu of taxes because we need to mitigate this taking of green space by purchasing other green space, by investing in other green space. So I would be all for an inventory of these spaces to be made available to the various boards and that approve this sort of thing, and so that they can be aware of the importance of these to the town.
Sure. Margaret, is that something that the payment in lieu of taxes idea, has that ever been floated in Longmeadow?
Not to my knowledge. I have spoken to several people about it. I know it goes on in Boston. I mean, Boston actually levies on nonprofits, including places like Boston College and Boston University. I believe they levy 25% of the property tax if that was a commercial or a residential property. I'm not sure which. And half of that can come from grants to the town, whether that's scholarships for Boston high school students to attend, or, you know, putting up tennis courts or something like that. The other half of that 25% has to be money, cash, all right? Holyoke did this recently with a nonprofit because they were taking a facility that would have, I guess, paid around $7,000 or $8,000 a year in residential property taxes off the tax rolls. I'm sure they're not paying that rate, but they're paying something. So, you know, I welcome nonprofits to Longmeadow. I think they provide a lot of benefits to people from ages of 0 to 100 or older. But we are getting to I feel we are getting to the point where everyone has to pitch in to pay for services such as police and fire, and also to mitigate the loss of green space if that is in fact what is happening with new development.
Sure. So another recommendation that might come out of that could loop back to the public-private partnership idea. If nothing else, to get these players and these various actors to sit down together at a table, because most of the damage is already done, meaning there isn't that much space left to be developed in Longmeadow, but you do have a handful of you know, existing nonprofit landowners, and starting that conversation would be a really valuable use of time.
I do want to just add one thing, if I can, from the Conservation Commission point of view, which is that there are many times that I've seen where developers come in, and this happened on Tennyson, where there was, for the homes that were built on Tennyson back in the late 70s, early 80s, there was a promise from the developer to, since they were taking some wetlands to the Conservation Commission, that they would keep 2 plots of land as wetlands, which has not really worked out, but it turns out that there was absolutely no filing with any of the deeds that would show that this would be a continuation. So now there seems to be some movement on, for example, on Tennyson, where the developer doesn't want to own that property anymore and continue to just pay for it, but wants to build houses on it. So whatever happens with that, whether it be what Margaret's talking about in terms of the nonprofit giving back or something, there has to be some legal connection that enforces that going forward, so that we don't lose what an agreement might be temporarily, go and have to rely on the memory of, in our case, the chair.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so.
Sure, you don't want to rely on handshake agreements. Okay. Well, this is, I think we've got a really good discussion going on here. We've got a couple of notes in the chat. Barry, any questions in the chat that we haven't addressed?
I'm not sure questions. There's definitely a very good discussion, and I think we probably need to do some work to find the answers. I know we have one select board member that is tuned in now. I don't know if he knows the answer to, as far as a holistic approach to all nonprofits to address Margaret's question, but some of the chat items have to do with some details. So not really questions, more comments that we can review and discuss in our group meeting for sure, to make sure it's appropriate that they are incorporated.
Okay, great. So let's jump into our next conversation topic. Oh, these are just some maps. We can, again, if during our discussion we want to be looking at these maps, just let me know and I'll flip back to them. So the next one here, we're talking about facilities and recreation. Again, this can be passive or active recreation, so it can be our playing fields or it can be our trails. And the two goals that are particularly relevant here are number 1 and 2. So our town-owned parks and conservation areas are used for their intended and allowed purposes and safe for all users. And then recreation needs of all residents are met by expanding opportunities and upgrading conditions of existing facilities. Quite a few new proposed objectives here that came out of really the survey results, trying to address the needs that were put forward through the survey. So do we have any committee members that want to jump in here?
So this is our area, I do believe, for goals 1 and 2, and definitely appreciate the responses. Some of them were similar to the first go around, but what we found interesting, or what actually, I can't speak for Jamie or Margaret, but I'm sure they will speak, improve compliance with posted rules and regulations for town parks. I think taking a step backwards from that, what we are finding is we need an update of our existing rules and regulations. It's been many years since we've updated some of the park rules. A recent event is what is happening at Laurel Park, which I was surprised Laurel didn't come out more on the survey, because it's a pretty loved park in town as well. Certainly more passive recreation, but there's bike paths, tracks, I should say, that are built in the park, and it's unclear to some users if that's allowed, if it's not allowed, and that's really one small example of many things that it would, and actually it's on the park board agenda for next week to look at the park rules and see where we can make changes, make improvements. Maybe there's things that need to be taken out as well. I don't know if Margaret has a comment or if Jamie wants to speak to the first goal at all, but I think having rules and regulations that make sense for users and are fair and are equitable to users would incorporate a lot of goals in different areas as well.
So Barry, I'm sorry, just real quick to recap there, I'm hearing the idea for an action would be to look at the existing park rules and regs, update those, and then upgrade the signage accordingly, so that it's not just the management or the managers, the resource managers that understand the new rules, but also the people who are using those facilities. Is that right?
It's correct. And I think as we've gone through it, and there's a couple processes that are going on simultaneously. One of them was the Conway School project, which was very specific to Laurel and Bliss Parks. And it came up regarding signage, and people use the parks in different ways. I think we understand that some people drive in. Not everyone uses main entrances. If you think of Bliss and Laurel Parks as good examples, there's a multitude of ways for people to get in on foot through paths and things like that. So targeting those areas for signage to help inform our users would probably lead to more compliance. So I think that could easily be incorporated into a goal. And yes, Betsy, the signage is outdated, very much outdated. We have the kiosks that are in some of the parks. We also have the rule signs that are in all of the parks, and that is being looked at by the park board next week at their August meeting. So thank you. I don't know if Janie or Margaret want to comment further on either of those goals. I mean, I just kind of talked about safety. If not, I can continue on.
Barry, I think you've summarized it really well as far as I'm concerned.
Okay.
I agree, Barry. And I think to your point on the multiple entrances into those parks is it's a very important thing to at least make sure there's guidelines going into all those different entrances into Bliss and Pearl to help with the users of the park. Make sure they understand what they can and can't do.
Absolutely. And I think as we move forward on the not Wolf Swamp School, but Wolf Swamp Fields and that project, one of the components that's going to be incorporated is better access to the walking trails on the southeast side, so toward the south of the park. So expanding recreational use opportunities, but perhaps educational resources, and maybe that are partnering with other committees like Conservation Commission that really, I don't know if all residents realize and understand that there's a wealth of information in terms of what our obligations are in terms of postings and usage and changes and things like that. But it would be a nice partnership. And town recreational resources are accessible. So that is something that the town took part, and it will be part of the final open space plan, but an inventory of town resources and accessibility ratings and that sort of a thing. So that's something that the town did with the parks, with the schools, and with public buildings. And another reason that this plan is essential is because sometimes grant opportunities do come up, for different reasons and from different organizations, and to have an updated open space plan that validates our need for that really helps us and puts us in the running for that type of a grant. There is a question, you will have to control illegal off-road vehicle use. And that is something that when we had our Wolf Swamp Park meetings, that's something that is a very widespread problem. It's not a Longmeadow problem. We've actually done some communications with the Longmeadow police who reached out to the Enfield police, and the problem goes as far as South Windsor with the off-road vehicles. It's actually a very large issue. So we looked at the gating system and narrowing the gate so a walker or a stroller or a bike could fit, but certainly not an ATV. So we're hoping that that mechanism would limit the use of that. And another comment, police 1 and 4 staying at community gardens. So this is definitely not a new issue, and it's something that we didn't talk about the gardens specifically, but we did with Wolf Swamp. One of the major issues is it's really hard to catch them because by the time they're spotted and the police are called, the ATVs are long gone. So limiting their access is a potential tactic that we're thinking of using. There's another comment from a select board member. It just actually got lost on me. It had to do with funding opportunities, and when a town plans are updated and in alignment with town goals, it's much easier to secure grants and have community buy-in with them. So I think that might be it for the first goal. The second goal addresses recreation needs for all residents that are met by expanding opportunities.
Can I jump in with one thing? The first new objective under goal number 1, expanding educational resources about existing open spaces, trail networks, and other resources. Kristen had a comment that sort of echoes what I was thinking on that one. And I just wanted to put out the idea of some sort of whether it's a campaign, an outreach campaign. Let me see if I can find Kristen's, establishing a signage plan. So Kristen's comment, establishing a signage plan for the parks and conservation spaces would aid in creating the menu of tools needed for welcome, orientation, and rules education. I think that's great, that idea of a signage plan. And maybe part of that could be, other than signage, other than meeting people who are already coming to these places, how do we sort of positively reach those people before they even get there, right? So it's less of a well, stop, read the sign, and maybe turn around and go home, or stop, read the sign, and then come enjoy in these ways. But also, did you know that there are these 5 places in Longmeadow where you can do the type of recreational activity that you're looking to do? And so maybe combining those two into some sort of a project where you're doing that, you're improving your signage, and you're improving the overall on-site clarity of the rules, but you're also really helping bring people in a positive way.
Right, and I don't know if it was actually phrased as outreach campaign. I love that, and I think that provides uniformity, and it does a lot of proactive education as opposed to reactive.
Yeah.
I mean, and there's a multitude of examples with trash. I think during the pandemic and probably after, we are migrating toward, with regard to trash, carry in, carry out. And that's a policy that a lot of parks are adopting. And that would be great to have as part of a campaign with our signage, physical signage in the parks, but also perhaps electronic versions of that, welcome section on the website where people can look if they want to go hiking, where are the best places to hike, if they want to go biking, where are the best places to do that, if they want to go bird watching, listing the amenities, but also the guidelines and the rules of those individuals.
Yeah, great. Okay, sorry to interrupt there.
No, I appreciate that. But they really didn't talk too much about the objectives. They kind of went over the goals. Well, I did actually a little bit. So I'm just going through the comments quickly. Add enforcement component with educational methods fail to improve compliance. That is something that is a weakness and we struggle with, that it's much easier to develop rules and regulations and put signage up, but then the compliance piece is probably the most difficult. And I don't think we're alone in Longmeadow with that. Some communities that have amenities such as dog parks, which we don't have, and skate parks are very much self-regulated, and the enforcement, good or bad, falls on the users. And there's a real sense of ownership when the rules are laid out and the users know and they don't want that compromised. So perhaps that's a tactic that we try to employ. Having volunteer park rangers going kind of through the parks, and as they're walking through the parks, perhaps helping with enforcement, because I think due to our lack of resources, that's very difficult to achieve. There's that. With regard to the second goal, recreation needs of all residents are met by expanding opportunities and upgrading conditions of existing facilities. So this would be for all types of recreation and open space, passive as well as active, and certainly my purview is more of the active. So certainly if anyone from any of the other committees want to help discuss the more passive recreation opportunities. But in terms of organized sports, which was the older goal, provide a sufficient number of fields for each sport, that an appropriate period of field rotation can be applied to ensure the long-term health of facility. That is something, since the charter change, we have struggled with. Maximizing our resources, asking for resources when we don't have them, taking components and knowing what we can outsource and what we should make an investment in with either personnel or our own perhaps equipment through a capital plan. So being able to identify that. And I think one of the keys to that is more collaboration within town departments that regulate these options, but also more active role for our volunteer groups. We have really strong volunteer groups within our youth sports, very capable, very innovative, and very collaborative. So taking advantage of that could definitely benefit that goal. The three new, the first being expand playing hours and seasons for all recreational facilities. I think that's something that perhaps isn't new. I'm glad it came out in the survey. And one of the ways to meet that objective could be, well, certainly with regard to maintenance, but also lighting certain fields either with portable lights or permanent lights. And we do that. We have hybrid models so that we do that with football. Fall season tends to get dark very early, so we either move up the games or we have a lighting situation. So perhaps more of that. Meeting community needs for organized and informal team and individual sports, including skateboarding and basketball. And what I might add, I think we do a pretty good job with youth sports, but I hear more and more that having opportunities for adults, either with active recreation or organized passive recreation. It seems that as adults, our discretionary leisure time is more limited than that of youth, and giving opportunities for perhaps pickup. We have a lot of volleyball, we have indoor basketball, but perhaps outdoor basketball or more unstructured group walks, group fitness, that sort of a thing. And then the last new is providing safe, ample, and context appropriate space for dog owners to walk, run, and play with their pets. So this is a concept that cycles often, very often, and it is something that I think with this survey, if this continues to be a goal and if there's public support, that it is something that I feel we should look at. There's a couple comments that came in. Should mention the town meeting approval of the CPC funded for a skate park in the plan. And I like that Walter brought that up. That's skate parks are something, I mean, in my time here, maybe every decade, they get, I mean, I think they're popular, but they kind of gain momentum and groups come in. And this time there actually is a CPC funded study. I know there's a group that's pretty active, and it was the proposal writer and a group of constituents that have that interest level. There's a park board liaison, and they're doing some legwork before they do the study. They're looking at locations very informally, but very organized. So that will be interesting. And I would assume with the survey results that we could see something similar for a dog park. I think the survey results were indicative of interest. So it wouldn't surprise me if we took that route as well. I don't know if there are questions, if there's comments. I appreciate the comments in the chat because it's easy to kind of circle back to some of them. But if Margaret or Jamie have any other, I know they both have roles, Jamie on the school committee, Margaret on the park board, but they're both parents of athletes that have used the facilities and certainly wear many different hats. So if there's any other comments or anything I missed, please let me know. Maybe there's
sorry. I think the COVID pandemic interrupted a lot of planning, whether it was for better use of the fields, or more importantly, our youth sports volunteers. And one of the things I would like to be able for the park board to work with the DPW on is finding a way to get the volunteer groups, who are generally parents, to put in time to work on the fields. And we have come up against you can't be a volunteer and drive equipment and be insured by the town, drive town equipment, for marking fields or whatever. And what I'd like to do is explore with Mario the ability to hire these parents who are responsible adults and train them. And if we have to pay them a prevailing wage, we pay them. They'd be seasonal workers, just like the other seasonal workers. And they can decide to make those earnings going back to the whatever youth sports group, or they can keep them, it doesn't matter, but they're more than willing to do the work they have the time, and we really do need to make use of them because they know what to do, as opposed to just hiring someone from a temp agency or someone who has an interest in working for DPW, but really doesn't understand what it takes to make a softball field or a baseball field or a lacrosse field appropriate for play.
I think one thing that might be of public interest that I didn't mention, but I should mention, and that is the Wolf Swamp Park. I think we talked, I kind of went over it briefly, but that project is underway. It's in the bidding process now, so we should break ground in September, and that's for the 1.5 plus renovation and reconstruction of that field space. So that is something I know that's of public interest. It will take it out of commission for a little while. However, I think we will we'll be very happy with the end result.
Great, and I just wanted to address Margaret's comment there. I kind of love the idea that you're putting forward there. It's sort of out of the box. It makes me curious of how other communities do that. Other communities where there actually is an active volunteer base who's ready and willing to do this stuff, but that the DPW is understandably protective of their equipment and or following the laws of who can do that work and who can't. So I think that's a great action idea to look into that and figure out a way to use the people who are willing to do the work. So I thank you for offering that. If we don't have any other comments on the facilities and recreation goals, I know we will on the next slide, so we could move on and talk about maintenance. Let's ask if anyone has more comments on this slide. Please let us know in the message in the chat field right now.
And I think Tim is having technical difficulties. He may or may not be with us, so I'm happy to present with Kristen and answer any questions if there are questions.
I'm back on. I'm at an outage of internet, but I'm back on now.
Okay, great. So our final discussion topic is maintenance and stewardship. And for this, we're looking again at goal number 1. Town-owned parks and conservation areas are used for their intended and allowed purposes and safe for all users. And then goal number 3, local parks and conservation areas are well cared for, managed, and maintained. And there's a lot in that one goal statement right there. So I'm going to hand this over to Tim and Kristen to lead this discussion.
I guess I could start by telling you what my understanding. I'm pretty new. I've been at the DPW only 3 months, and my role as town engineer isn't really the maintenance of the parks. That's more Jeff McAlmond. But my understanding is, all the parks, athletic fields, open space, that needs mowing, that kind of stuff is done by the DPW. Trash removal, I think, is like twice a week. Someone else spoke about lining the fields. All that stuff is under the DPW. But what Mario kind of emphasized to me is we're largely reacting to when there's a problem. If it's a bike path that's been built up where it shouldn't be and needs to be removed, we're doing that. But it's kind of on a reactive basis. Those kinds of things as they fall into the maintenance category. But the irrigation, all that is the guys at the DPW are. That's the maintenance we're doing right now.
Thanks, Tim. This is Kristen. And just a couple of things I wanted to add was in the survey, we did have a lot of kind of smaller ticket items, not really smaller, but, trash pickup and caring for the trees and general maintenance. And I think it's important for us to work as a town and as a committee to come up with a way in which some of those basic maintenance needs can be addressed so that there's kind of regular care and stewardship of the parks and capitalize on the existing paid staff, but as was previously mentioned, to tap into the user groups as well as volunteers to kind of support that. And I think that speaks to more the education piece and the stewardship piece in this particular goal. And then I think there's the larger ticket items and, you know, maybe some capitalizing on some existing grants and creative funding sources through maybe even user groups are different strategies that might come into play. But certainly, you know, here expanding the educational understanding and the connection to the resource can help with reducing, as Tim just mentioned, kind of inappropriate damage to the existing resources, and then, you know, building a culture and an affinity to care for the properties that we're using, both actively and passively.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
The maintenance and stewardship is a combination of things, as people have been talking about, because we really do need better compliance from the users of these parks and conservation areas. In the conservation area, I'm not even sure who's doing a lot of dumping, but there is a lot of dumping that happens, especially around the river area. But in the parks, one of the things that has been brought up, the DPW has been responsible for the most part for putting out trash cans, emptying the trash cans, and giving enough of that opportunity to actually throw their waste away in an appropriate way. I think it would be good to know where the DPW is on all of this, because I find that, for example, our recycling commission has been providing information to the DPW about these joint waste and recycle bins that are available and with a grant, but the DPW, from what I'm told, doesn't want to, or views it as more work for them in order to empty. I'd like to know more about what the barriers are from what the town is able to do, and why it seems that what we're calling upon them to do in this overall thing, so that we can get a handle. I mean, it's wonderful to have volunteers from the community coming in to do this, and I think it'd be great to have opportunities to do Earth Days and Clean Days and things like that. And maybe even, I think somebody was presenting the possibility of a user fee to support the stewardship and maintenance. But again, when we have, because I've heard from town people saying, well, why isn't the DPW picking up the garbage? I don't know. I don't know what's going on with them. I don't know what their requirements are. And when we talk about stewardship, there's also a lack of information and training going into the people who staff it. For example, we're seeing, and this is getting to be one of my little soapbox issues, invasive species being spread from one area to another because the DPW may be mowing and then taking the same garbage with seeds from invasive species and putting them down into another area. I think we also need to look at what we have within the town, and I just want to throw that in, and I'm not sure where it sits on this, but I think it's part of maintenance and stewardship. So,
Margaret, aside from the invasive species part of what you just said, was most of it around public parks where there are trash receptacles and sort of making sure those if they're there, that they're being emptied?
They're not empty. I mean, because I've been walking through Laurel and Bliss, as many people have, and I'm ending up carrying my garbage home with me if I need to throw it out, because there's no place to put it.
Right.
So although it's been so hot in this last week or so, I haven't done any of the walking, so I don't know if anything's happened in general.
Yeah, I
But
just wanted to make sure that I understood the issue.
Yeah.
And then it's interesting because Barry mentioned earlier the idea of shifting towards a carry in, carry out, sort of a leave no trace model. And I don't know if that's a discussion that's happening amongst various town departments, including DPW, or if that's specific to certain conservation properties. But it's another one of these things where being clear about what the expectations are is sort of the first step, right?
yes, I think that would be a good thing to do. Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. Andrea, I was curious, as you were speaking, I think about the kind of a maintenance plan or a work plan that's associated with these different properties by season, and being able to assess, what is the care and maintenance duties? What do they take? What's the manpower associated with that? And then figuring out what it is the DPW can handle. Does DPW need to be augmented, as in the chat, finding out, maybe a surcharge or user fee to help either provide additional seasonal staff to DPW or find another way to help for the care and the maintenance through an outside vendor. Are those tools that are worth looking at?
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think one of the, you could put an action in the OSRP to do that evaluation for all public properties, care and maintenance plan that goes down to the level of detail of what sort of man, human, woman power is needed, or you could put a cost to it. And then saying what DPW does already do and what they have the capacity to do realistically, so that you have a clear sort of roadmap of, all right, we know that these are the gaps. Now let's figure out how to fill them.
I would love to see that in the plan. I think that makes a lot of sense, and that's a great idea.
I know that we have been contacted by at least one of the select board members, not Mark, saying, what can the park board do to involve volunteers, to bring in funding, to take the burden of maintenance, not totally off the town, but to reduce it. And I can only imagine that that is going to grow, both for what we'd call active recreation, the athletic fields, and passive recreation.
All right, I'm just I'm looking at some of the comments here. Also, Barry's comment: increased fees are coming for field and maintenance and direct costs. I'm curious if this relates to the conversation we were just having. Are those increased fees going directly back into maintenance of all properties, or is it for specific properties?
It really depends. I think it came about with regard to the Wolf Swamp field. There are field usage fees that every child or every parent pays. And right now it's pretty nominal. But as we put together the plan for Wolf Swamp, one of the major concerns was, well, we can't build this and not maintain it. So the DPW did come up with maintenance standards, a plan, and a budget. And the increase is incredibly huge. So the thought process at this point, while we haven't built it yet, is 1/3 of the cost will come from the town's general fund. Another third will come from user fees, which will probably go up to double-digit fees, which they're not now, but they probably will for each user. And then a campaign for fundraising, which we're hoping, some of us are hoping, looks like a banner sponsorship program that we could utilize. I think the initial thought was to pilot that with Wolf Swamp fields and see what we need to do to change that sort of a thing. I will say that we did develop, and this was many years ago, we had a subcommittee that had the school's athletic director, and a school committee member and a select board member and myself, DPW, and we came up with maintenance standards. I can't speak to I know Tim is here, but I don't think it's his purview unless he wants to comment. But the maintenance, I think we are looking, and the DPW has been really supportive of outsourcing certain components. So that's probably the direction that we are heading. It's nice to have validation within this plan, but the DPW is supportive of that. And I'm seeing new comments. Do we issue special use permits for outside uses or larger events, jamborees with fees associated? Partly, yes. There's lacrosse jamborees, events, things like that. They're primarily at Wolf Swamp, but because those fields had deteriorated, really we lost all of the renters that we had. So the thought is that yes, we could subsidize some of our revenue, not completely on the backs of the users, but perhaps signage and larger events, that sort of a thing. So we do it, but not to the full extent. And I am glad as well that Carla is here. And that was the last comment. So I don't think we missed any.
Okay, the only other comment I'm seeing here is regarding the full-time tree warden. The town could use a full-time tree warden who's also certified Massachusetts as a Massachusetts arborist, and this is with regards to sustaining a healthy tree belt, which is an objective under goal number 3. And yeah, certainly having that expertise and a paid position in town. Most towns have tree wardens that are they sort of exist by title only. Oftentimes they are an existing town employee with a full-time job who takes on the title because someone needs to have it, and that person doesn't always have experience, or even if they do have experience, they don't have the time to really put into doing this job. So I think that it's a great idea, and if there's a will and a way to fund that in town, then it's certainly worth pursuing.
We were very spoiled for maybe a little over a year with an amazing tree warden. I believe it's funded as a very part-time position, and he was exceeding that. And Pat and I serve on the tree committee, so we every month will hear kind of the woes that there's so many aspects, not just damaged trees, but tree inventory, planting. Our planting program has increased by, I would guess, at least 100%. I don't know if he is, maybe Tim knows, since Tim let us know that the new tree warden was hired 2 weeks ago. I don't know if he is full-time or if he is a certified arborist, but I can get that information.
His name is Rick Mastriani. The position is not a full-time position. I think, I know the salary is $10,000 a year, and the work is heavier in the summer and the spring than it is in the winter. So the hours it's not a set number of hours every week, but he's probably working right now about 2 days a week. And I believe he has about 30 years of experience. I believe he is a certified arborist. He was in Springfield for a lot of those years. He's definitely an experienced tree warden. So far, everybody thinks he's doing a great job.
Well, that's great, and I know that there was an effort that he's probably picking up on to complete the tree inventory that was sort of going on in force a year ago when I was working with the committee on the municipal vulnerability preparedness plan. That was a major priority that came out of that planning process.
Yeah, that's ongoing. What I'm picking up is Dave Marinelli was a lot probably more tech savvy with the GIS component to track the tree conditions and all that. But Rick's working through it. The other thing, I think Dave, before the transition, planted over 100 new trees, and watering of those trees is kind of falling on the engineering department. Some of the a couple of the engineering aides are doing that. So that's actually a bigger effort than, I wasn't here in the department last year, but that was an effort that wasn't kind of our department's responsibility until this year. And there are a lot of new trees, if you notice. So. And it's been very dry too. So.
Thank you for that. I think we're probably, unless there's any questions, almost to the point where we can have a discussion summary, unless anyone has any other questions. Could you use volunteers if Mario would allow volunteers to drive truck? That's a very logistical question. I don't know the answer to. I don't think it's Mario's in his purview. I think it would be an insurance question that perhaps our finance department could answer tomorrow. So I will make note of that and I will get an answer if volunteers can use town trucks. My guess is no, based on some of the occurrences we've had with field maintenance and volunteers asking if they can use, I mean, trimmers, I think yes, and minor things, but I think the discussion was a piece of heavier equipment at Turner, and it was a no.
I'll talk to Mario. I think what you're saying, Barry, is true. That there's probably some insurance and other requirements that pose problems with that. I'm not certain of this, but I'm pretty sure. I did a lot of coaching when my sons were younger, and Southwick had some beautiful fields where the parents and the coaches maintained it. But I believe that was all privately owned. It wasn't town-owned recreational facilities.
I believe you're right. I think it's town-owned. So it may change. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know in the context. One of the comments, volunteers could be bonded by town for limited use. I don't know if that's true in a municipal setting, but I will definitely those two questions are next to each other in my list, and I will investigate that and report back. So it is part of the record.
And I'd just like to remind folks that the CPC funds cannot be used to purchase equipment to maintain the fields by volunteers. There were a couple of attempts, at least one recently, where a parent group wanted to buy equipment so that they could take over some of the maintenance, and that is not permitted by the regulations.
That's good to know. It's too bad, but good to know.
Yeah.
But it also seems to align with some of the other limitations we're hearing in general about volunteers doing the maintenance work on these properties. So I think there are some good ideas to explore here about how to find ways to make that work. Barry, you're muted.
Yes. No, I muted and unmuted. I mean, I know with volunteers, I like Kristen's, I appreciate the comment, creating a formal volunteer program with form waivers may enable a more expanded role for volunteers. And I think in some contexts that is very viable. I think where our greatest needs are, we have struggled with the logistics with this. Volunteer groups tend to be very cyclical in the youth sports context, not necessarily in the neighborhood context. People live in their neighborhoods for a longer time, but we'll have a very strong core group of volunteers, and their kids will go through 5 years of baseball and then they're gone, and all the training, all the expertise, all the knowledge, everything's gone. So I mean, it's probably something that we could explore, and I think it's worth it. So in some contexts, it would work and it would be successful. In others, it might be more challenging. That would be my comment to that.
All right, so why don't we go into the summary? I've got some notes. Barry, if you're okay with it, I'll talk about, we'll go topic by topic, and maybe I'll give my bullets from the first topic, and if I missed any, you fill in, and then I'll jump over to the second topic. Okay, so first topic, I think one of the things that stood out is the idea that we need to make sure that we're getting we're putting some meat on these goals and objectives and making sure that they can be folded into daily operations, meaning our actual municipal operations, but also our regulations, and they don't just end up sitting in this plan on a shelf somewhere. The specific conversation we had was about concern over loss of impervious surface and how we might look at something like a payment in lieu of sorry, not payment in lieu of taxes, but whether it's investigating, identifying existing sponges we're talking about, and showing the volume or the value of those existing parcels, comparing that against the new bylaw that we have for stormwater management on development over 1 acre, seeing what that misses and where it needs to be built upon. And then also the conversation about nonprofit landowners needing to sort of contribute more to resilience efforts, either with money or with some other agreement. And that's where the payment in lieu of taxes conversation came in. So some really good ideas to explore there. All right, so if nothing else on that, topic number 2, which was our recreation facilities topic. Some action ideas that came out of this was to look at existing park rules and regulations, and then as you're upgrading the rules and regulations, upgrading the physical signage accordingly. Targeting areas where parks are accessed in sort of non-primary entrances, and making sure that signage is going there, because it seems like there's a lot of traffic coming in these side entrances. I like the idea of using park design to limit access, and the conversation about ATVs. It's really hard to rely on the police department or other users for enforcement even. And in some cases it's hard to rely solely on compliance of posted signage. So when we talk about making upgrades to our facilities, making sure that they're designed with multi-purpose in mind, multiple purposes in mind, and that if you have to repave or re-gravel an entryway to a park, make sure that you're including those bollards that prohibit off-road vehicles from entering. We talked about an outreach campaign to educate residents about resources that are available, including information, sort of taking advantage of whatever type of campaign you're doing, to talk about things like carry in, carry out, leave no trace, start sort of sprinkling in the ideas that people will see in signage into other sorts of materials, so it has broader distribution. Let's see. More coordination between the departments and more active management of volunteer groups, and this came out in a couple of parts of the discussion. The idea that having a clear volunteer plan, that there's a lot of energy and there are a lot of people that are willing to pitch in, but really it needs to be managed, so that those people and those offers of assistance can be put to efficient use. The idea of lighting some fields with portable or permanent lights, I think that's a sort of something that we can directly carry over into a proposed action that meets a few of the objectives on that list. And then adding something for including opportunities for adults on objective 3, so that we acknowledge the fact that we have adults who are also looking for these opportunities and maybe feeling that they don't have the facilities they need either. Let's see. And then we started the conversation about overcoming these barriers of where volunteers cross over into public municipal sort of maintenance operations, and how do we bridge that gap? How do we make it so that volunteers, again, are able to pitch in the ways that they're willing to, and sort of working within existing liabilities. Anything on that topic, Barry, that you want to add? Okay. So then last with maintenance, and again, we're sort of crossing over back and forth on a lot of these, there's a lot of overlap. The idea that maintenance currently happens in a lot of ways on a reactionary basis, and that is not unique to Longmeadow, but that is something that obviously we'd like to change. The idea that we want to make sure that basic maintenance needs are addressed, and maybe smaller needs can be addressed by existing DPW and volunteer groups simply by doing some of this organization and management that we're talking about. But then there are larger issues and things like dumping around the Connecticut River, or if it's a large scale facility improvement project that can't just be sort of picked at piece by piece, that might need some more serious investment. Looking at the trash cans on public properties and having an understanding and sort of getting some clarity about what the expectations are for those trash cans, and then broadening that to say, what are the expectations for each park property, each park and open space property that is managed by the town. And this came out to an idea of doing a study to really dig into what are the care and maintenance needs for each property based on the season. What sort of manpower do we need for each one? What can DPW do? What can't they do? And how do we fill the gaps? And supporting completion of the tree inventory was something I took away from sort of the last part of that discussion. And then we've had a number of other great action ideas that came into the chat box. And rather than read through all of those, again, this meeting has been recorded, and that includes a transcript of the chat box. So we'll have that to reference back to, and anyone following along at home will be able to find all of this material on the OSRP website, on the town's website. There's an OSRP sort of landing page there where you can review those, and many of these suggestions are going to be translated into actions into the draft plan that will be publicly available in just a couple weeks. So with that, I would like to thank everyone for participating. The next steps that we've got here, I mentioned these in the beginning, but again, we're going to refine these goals and objectives with the committee at our next meeting, which is our last committee meeting. We'll also build out the action plan, and then we'll go through the final public review process. Our goal is to have a final draft, or a draft plan rather, posted for public review for August 14th. If you have any questions or any comments that you weren't able to put into the chat box today, you can reach Barry or I at our email addresses on this slide. The existing plan is also available online, and then again, that landing page, which is linked here. So we again appreciate everyone's participation today. I want to open it up. Any last questions while we're still live? All right. Well, it's been a very fruitful discussion tonight, and I am glad everyone was able to join in and join the discussion.
Emily and Barry, thank you both for all your work. I know I'm speaking for many, many people when I say we really appreciate it. This is Margaret Rockus.
Thanks, Margaret.
I want to echo what Margaret said. Thank you all for the people who participated, but Emily and Barry for leading this effort and getting us moving on it. Really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you to Emily. Emily put together an awesome presentation, very informative. You can find it on the town's website, as well as a synopsis of all of the survey results. So if that piqued your interest, referencing the survey, you can always do that, and this will be as well. I believe LCTV is still filming, so you should be able to get this if you are interested in rewatching it, or if you have anyone interested in seeing it that couldn't join us tonight, they can join us that way. But Emily, thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Okay, committee members, we'll see you in a few weeks, and everyone else, thanks for joining and have a great night.